My name is Dr. Manuel G. Saldivar. I'm a faculty member at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in Brownsville, Texas. This presentation is entitled An Overview of Careers in Psychology. The purpose of this presentation is to give prospective psychologists and psychology majors some background information regarding the field of psychology and the various opportunities that are available within this exciting field. I'm going to be discussing 5 different topics related to this idea of what it is to be a psychologist. First, it's important to define what we mean by the field of psychology. Where do psychologists work? What different career paths are available for individuals working in psychology? What does a job outlook look like? And then finally, where can anyone who's interested in learning more find additional information? To tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a cognitive and educational psychologist. I did my doctoral work at the University of Colorado in Boulder, Colorado. I have 2 PhDs, one in education, the other in cognitive science. So those 2 degrees together gave me a strong background in both understanding cognition, how the human mind works, and in education, how we learn. So that is the area where I work. For more information about me or my background, my website is mgsaldivar.com. But the real thing I want to emphasize is not my own background or career, but the field that I work in, because I think it's a very exciting field. It's one that has brought me a lot of professional enjoyment and I think made me the person I am today. However, a lot of people that are looking at coming into this field, especially undergraduate students, bachelor's degree students, often have a very narrow view of what it means to be a psychologist. I think because of the perception that's developed from watching TV shows like Dr. Phil, which can be entertaining but is not exactly representative of the real world of most psychologists. Also, there are a lot of areas where psychologists work that do not make for good TV shows or don't make for good characters in TV and movies. And so we often don't hear about those different areas. So that's where I want to focus on today. But again, before we talk about the individuals working in the field, we need to make sure what we mean by psychology. So at its core, psychology is the study of human behavior, cognitive behavior. How do we think? How do our minds work and process information and deal with the world around us? How do our emotions work? Obviously, emotions are also heavily influenced by our brain, as is cognition, but there are some differences here. How do humans behave in social settings? All of us are parts of cultural groups of different kinds, whether we call that a family or a country or a gender or a racial group, ethnic group. The way that we humans interact with each other in a social manner, of course, has a huge influence on our behavior and vice versa. And then finally, another aspect of human behavior is the biological or physiological. Our bodies, not just our brains, but our bodies do stuff that influences our behavior and vice versa. And so that is another aspect of the study of human behavior. But moreover, I think it's also important to understand that psychologists don't just study human behavior, we also work to find evidence to help develop what we call the body of knowledge, the aggregated understanding of human behavior. And so psychologists work to find this evidence by observing behavior. Often behavioral evidence comes from a laboratory setting or a control setting. So if you've ever seen a movie or TV show where a psychologist wearing a white lab coat and holding a clipboard is asking children, let's say, to work on a puzzle or trying to get a mouse or a rat to go through a maze, those are very simple examples of behavioral evidence. We observe the behaviors of humans or sometimes non-humans to try and understand why we do the things we do. Of course, some psychologists gather evidence or find evidence in medical or clinical settings. So when a client or a patient presents some kind of behavioral disorder, for example, or mental illness, or is in some kind of psychological distress, that can be a source of evidence, which in turn, certainly beyond allowing the psychologist to help that particular individual, which is very important, The psychologist can also take that experience, that evidence, and feed it back into the field of psychology so others can learn from that. A really growing area, one that I myself have done a little bit of work in, is computational psychology. So this is when we find evidence not actually by observing humans, but by creating computer systems or networks that are designed or built to mimic human behavior. Sometimes, for example, we might have a psychological question that would be very tough just on practical terms in terms of the cost or the time commitment or the scale. Sometimes we can't study actual humans, so we might create a computer model to help us get some hints as to how humans would react. In other cases, we may have a research question that we feel would really add to our understanding of human behavior if we're able to find evidence to answer that question. And yet, the proposed study, the proposed research itself, may be unethical to carry out on actual human beings. Ethics are important to all research, but especially to research involving humans. So a researcher might create a computational model that has been developed to mimic human behavior to let us study something in a computer simulation that would be unethical or, as I say, impractical to carry out in the real world. And then finally, another area that I myself do a lot of work in is finding evidence regarding human behavior by studying statistics, looking at broad patterns of behavior and trying to identify um, where behavior comes from, what behaviors are exhibited, how we might influence behavior. One brief aside at this point before I move on, a lot of psychology majors, undergraduate majors in particular, often express surprise about having to study statistics, which is, if not universal, then pretty much close to universal for psychology majors. Students, especially as I say, who come in with what I call the Dr. Phil vision of psychology, often say, "Well, I don't know why I need psychology. What do, I mean, I don't, excuse me, I don't know why I need statistics. What is that really benefiting me?" Um, and I understand the root of the question, I guess, but the answer is, in order to connect the place, the setting, the situation where a psychologist is working, whether it's me or anyone else, we need to be able to connect our own experiences, our own findings with the larger body of knowledge that we call psychology. And one of the ways that we do that is by using statistical evidence to compare what we're finding, what we're observing, what we're measuring with the larger field. And so statistics is a very, very important part of psychology, as challenging as I understand this might be for a lot of newer students. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this graph because you can pause this video and read it more slowly at your own pace, but I thought it would be interesting to point out where psychologists work. This research study conducted by Michalski et al. That I cite here at the very top under the title of the slide. They studied doctoral level psychologists, which are the easiest to identify for reasons that I'll talk about in a second. And they found that, just to hit a couple of high points, almost 26% of psychologists worked at a university or a four-year college. That's about a quarter. Another quarter worked in hospital or other health service settings. And then another quarter together, about 26%, 27% worked in government or VA medical centers or business and nonprofit. And then other psychologists, as you can see from the graph, worked in medical schools or other academic settings. That's about 6.3%. About 8% worked in K-12 schools or other educational settings at that level. And then about 6% worked in independent practice. So again, the point here is not just to divide up the field of psychology, but also give you an idea of where can psychologists do their work. So to simplify, just for the purposes of our discussion, psychology careers basically break down in terms of how the practitioner, how the psychologist is applying the field of psychology. So we have therapeutic applications, applied applications, and then finally research applications. Now, I want to stress that I'm making this division just for the ease of this discussion, this presentation. There is a lot of overlap in the real world. Researchers certainly can get involved in therapeutic questions or applied questions. Therapeutic psychologists often conduct research and so on and so forth. Now, therapeutic specialties include clinical psychology. The clinical psychologists assess and treat mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. Um, some of them will focus on specific populations, such as young people, families. Others might focus on specific problems or syndromes, such as phobias or clinical depression. Counseling psychologists help people recognize their strengths and resources in order to cope with everyday problems. They may work in areas such as psychotherapy or teaching. Um, some of them focus on career or work problems. So, again, the idea here is that it's counseling psychologists and clinical psychologists look at human behavior with an eye or an aim towards providing some kind of therapeutic service. Health psychologists are often not well known to people that are not in the field, but they specialize in the biological, psychological, and social factors that affect health and illness. So they might study, work in a healthcare setting and study how patients handle illness, why some patients don't follow medical advice, or maybe looking at effective ways to control uh, healthcare habits or behaviors that patients might exhibit. Rehabilitation psychology is also not too well known. They work with individuals who might have been the victim of a serious medical disorder, such as a stroke or a heart attack, accident victims, people with intellectual disabilities, and they help these clients adapt to their situation and improve their lives by helping them cope with whatever their challenge is. Sport psychologists help athletes refine their uh, approach to their sport or their athletic activity in terms of understanding their motivation, dealing with anxiety, fear of failure. Now, applied specialties include community psychologists. This is an area that also is often not well known outside of the field. Um, so, community psychologists work with community groups to help individuals improve their lives and their communities by understanding how negative circumstances such as poverty or trauma affect people, helping individuals understand how to empower themselves in order to improve their communities. Examples include helping hurricane victims, partnering with individuals in neighborhoods to prevent crime or bullying. Um, Another applied specialty is educational. I have a background in this myself. So educational psychologists look at how we learn. What does it mean to have effective learning? How do we teach effectively? We also look at different factors that affect learning and teaching, such as student motivation or the social economic background of students. Engineering psychologists conduct research on how people work with machines, and by machines here we include computers. So, for example, how could you design a computer system to minimize the eye strain on the user? Or how could you develop an assembly line that interacts best with the humans that have to work with this machine? Environmental psychologists study how humans interact with the environment. So, this is pretty broad, but it can involve everything from looking at problems in the workplace to uh, looking at issues in architecture and landscape to help design and develop buildings, parks, other facilities that humans work in to make sure that they're psychologically friendly for humans. Forensic psychologists we often see in TV or movies. So these individuals apply psychological principles to legal issues. They often have to have expertise within the judicial system. For example, they might work with a judge to help evaluate a child during a child custody legal matter. They can sometimes evaluate a defendant's mental competence. Question about whether or not someone should stand trial. These folks often have deep training, not just in psychology, but also in the legal system. Industrial and organizational psychologists apply psychological principles and especially research methods to the workplace. And the goal here is to improve productivity, improve the quality of work life, often to improve the health of workers. And then finally, school psychologists, here in this section on applied psychology, um, They specialize in offering comprehensive services to children, young people, often families, in school or in educational settings. So they might evaluate students, for example, for a learning disability. They can offer counseling to students and their family, or even school staff, such as teachers, on behavioral issues that affect students. These individuals usually work for school districts. In psychology include cognitive psychology. So this is the area where I work. Um, so cognitive psychologists study human thinking, how we form memories, our perception, um, how we learn, how we produce language. It's a pretty broad area, but an exciting one for research. Developmental psychologists study how human beings develop over the lifespan, over our lifetimes. For a long time, this specialty focused on children and adolescents, but in recent years, there's been a lot of interest also in investigating the kinds of factors that impact humans as we age, as we grow older. Evolutionary psychology is an exciting area. Um, Evolution applies to the development of human behavior as much as it does to other factors in our biology. So, as an example, evolutionary principles such as mutation, adaptation, which have been studied by biologists for many decades, are also applied by evolutionary psychologists to looking at how human behavior has developed and what influences changes in human behavior. Neuropsychologists, sometimes called behavioral neuropsychologists or neuroscientists, these terms have a lot of overlap. They explore the relationships between brain systems and behavior. This often is happening at the cellular or even below the cellular level. Questions such as how are memories formed? Um, how do we transmit our how do the cells in the brain work to transmit information one to another? Sort of looking at how our brains work in a very fundamental sense. Quantitative psychologists, or sometimes called measurement psychologists, an area where I work also. Um, we focus on methods and techniques for designing experiments and analyzing data produced by psychological studies. Um, an easy example that I've actually been involved in myself in my own research. If you think of when you use a streaming video service like Netflix or Hulu, sometimes they will recommend uh, shows or movies to you and say other people who have a Netflix subscription and have enjoyed this show also enjoy this other show. That's an example of using quantitative and measurement methods to analyze past behavior, TV shows that you've watched, that you've streamed, and using various variables that are captured from that interaction you have with Netflix to help suggest other shows you might like. Social psychologists study how humans interact with one another and with a larger society that we're all part of. They look at things like interpersonal relationships and how um, groups and individuals influence one another, what kind of attitudes, prejudices, biases that we bring into our interactions with the world. So the job outlook for psychologists is pretty positive. Beginning in about the middle part of this current decade, the 2010s, there has been there have been findings that widespread retirements among psychologists who are baby boomers, so people in their 60s, are beginning to retire in pretty large numbers, and the generation coming after baby boomers is smaller, so there's going to be a number of job openings that will come because of these retirements. Areas that are looking to have a particular amount of growth include school psychology, the various clinical applications, and industrial and organizational psychology. Uh, Please note that the American Psychological Association, the APA, the big professional association for psychologists, as well as state licensing laws, reserve the term psychologist for people that have a doctoral degree, a terminal degree, usually a PhD. In some cases, a doctoral degree called a PsyD. I mentioned this just because, for this reason, a lot of times tracking the career paths of psychologists can be a little complicated because there are people that have training in psychology, of course, that do not have a doctoral degree. but they nonetheless are certainly applying psychological principles or using that kind of knowledge to do their work. So I mention that just because all these facts and figures I've presented apply or are based on doctoral level psychologists, but certainly individuals that have bachelor's and master's degrees in psychology are working in similar fields and can do similar kinds of work, although oftentimes they're not legally able to call themselves a psychologist. They may work under the supervision of a doctoral level psychologist. A major source for all this information, by the way, is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. If you'd like more information, I recommend going to the American Psychological Association's website, apa.org. Also, the U.S., as I mentioned, the U.S. Department of Labor has an office called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I actually created this shortened URL, bit.ly/20D8QLT. I know that's a mouthful, but I created that shortened URL, shortened web address, because if you type that in to a web browser, it'll take you directly not just to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but specifically to their website that talks about psychology and psychology careers. To conclude, I'd like to make some acknowledgments. This presentation is based on a publication from the APA that came out in 2011 called Careers in Psychology. So thanks to the APA for making that publication available. I recommend it as required reading, really, for any student who's looking at coming into this field. Other sources include the U.S. Department of Labor, as I mentioned, and also the Chronicle of Higher Education. I'd like to thank my students for inspiring me to develop this presentation and for all the other professional fulfillment that I get from working with college students. Finally, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Again, here's my website, mgsaldivar.com. Thank you for your attention, and good luck.